Hey there, it's Maria here, and I'm excited to welcome you to the final module of the Typography in Figma course. In this module, we'll dive into the world of advanced elements that will take your text layouts to the next level. Let's begin. Advanced layout elements are those that go beyond the basic text blocks and headings to add visual interest, improve readability, and enhance the overall structure of your text-based designs. These elements include grids, quotes, tables, lists, and illustrations. The key to using these elements effectively is to strike a balance between enhancing the design and avoiding clutter that distracts from the core content. I want my layout to be symmetrical and neatly aligned. One way to achieve this is to use a grid. So, what is a grid? A grid is a system of guidelines used to organize elements in a layout. It's like the underlying framework that holds the layout together. Think of a grid like a table that helps you organize your layout. Just as a table uses rows and columns to arrange information clearly, a grid uses horizontal and vertical lines to create a structure for your design. This structure ensures that all the elements in your layout are positioned consistently, leading to a more polished and professional look. And why are grids needed in design projects? In fact, all for the same purposes. Aligning elements to a grid helps the product look neat, its elements to be proportional to the format, and the viewer to perceive information in a certain rhythm. And the grid is also the best way to explain to developers how the layout should behave on screens of different sizes. Here are a few examples of how grids can be used to create different types of layouts. For example, to create a web page, an app, or a poster. To use grids effectively, it's crucial to understand the key components that make up their structure. Columns are the vertical building blocks of a grid. They extend from top to bottom, creating a sense of vertical rhythm. Each column typically maintains the same width, ensuring a consistent alignment. Gutters are the spaces between columns. They play a vital role in maintaining horizontal rhythm and enhancing the visual separation of columns. The size of gutters is typically determined by the desired layout style, but they tend to be smaller than the width of the columns themselves. Margins are the buffer zones surrounding the edges of the grid. They can provide visual breathing room around the content, prevent elements from touching the edges of the design, and establish a clear visual hierarchy. Rows are the horizontal counterparts to columns. They segment the layout horizontally and are particularly useful for organizing content into distinct sections or blocks. Modules are the intersection points of rows and columns. They form basic proportion units within a grid and define the fundamental building blocks of the layout. Let's delve into the intricacies of grids in Figma. Here, grids are independent of the global pixel grid of a project and not tied to a specific resolution or size. Grids can only be applied to frames, which are individual containers for design elements. These frames can be top-level elements or nested within other frames. The corresponding settings section can be found within the design panel. Here's how to apply a grid. Create a frame. Use the Frame tool on the toolbar to create a frame on the canvas. You can choose a predefined size like desktop from the options offered by Figma. Access grid settings. Navigate to the Layout Grid panel on the Design panel and click the plus icon next to it. By default, a square grid is applied to the frame. If you zoom in on the frame, you can see the individual square-shaped cells. After applying a grid to a frame, you can use the keyboard shortcut Shift+G to toggle the grid's visibility. This can be helpful during the design process. You can also click the Layout Grid Settings icon to access the grid's properties and update them. The first option allows you to adjust the cell size, or block size. You can adjust this by clicking and dragging the cursor on the left border of the input field, or by entering a specific numerical value. For example, you can create an 8-pixel square grid. This is a popular grid type, especially for apps. It uses square 8-pixel blocks to precisely position elements on the screen. This grid is convenient because it's a multiple of the sizes of most devices. This means that your layout elements will be perfectly placed across all devices, regardless of their size. You can also change the color of the grid using the familiar color picker window. For instance, I can choose blue to make it slightly easier on the eyes when working with the layout. The grid's opacity can also be adjusted, making it more or less visible. The opacity settings within this panel will automatically be reflected in the design panel as well. The next type of grid you can configure is a column grid. To select this type, go to the Grid Settings panel and choose Column instead of Grid. This will open additional settings for the active grid type, such as the number of columns. We can change the value. Let's enter 12. For column grids, you can also adjust the color and opacity. But there's also a new setting called Type. Currently, Stretch is selected. Let's see how this affects the layout. If you resize the frame to which the grid with the Stretch setting is applied, the width of the columns will automatically increase proportionally. In this window, you can also choose left alignment, center alignment, or right alignment. When resizing the frame with the right alignment, the columns will behave differently. They will remain fixed to the chosen edge of the layout. Let's choose center alignment for the columns. The next setting is the width. By placing the cursor in the width setting field, you can use keyboard shortcuts up and down to increase by 1 pixel, Shift plus up or Shift plus down to increase or decrease by 10 pixels. You can also manually enter the desired column width value in this field. The next setting allows you to adjust the gutters. I'll enter a value of 40 pixels. Here, you can also adjust the value by placing the cursor on the left border of the field and dragging. The last parameter in the active panel is called Offset. It is currently inactive. Let's change the grid behavior to Stretch. With this behavior, the parameter name is updated to Margin. Using this parameter, you can set the overall margins from the frame edges to the columns, and therefore to the future content. By increasing the value in the field, I will increase the free space around the edges of the layout. You can also enter a specific value, such as 100 pixels. When working with a grid that has a right, center, or left alignment setting, you can also adjust the offset. Changing this parameter will control the spacing from the edge to which the grid is aligned. You can apply multiple different grid types to a single frame. To do this, you can use the plus button again. I'll add another grid layer to the frame and this time create a new type, a row grid. This grid layer can be configured with its own color, opacity, margins, and other similar settings. In the grid section on the design panel, you can use the eye icon to temporarily hide grid layers and the minus icon to delete them. Figma also allows you to create a frame within another frame and apply a separate grid to the inner one. This is useful for designing hierarchical layouts where individual elements of lower hierarchy levels have their own alignment. You can also copy grids. With the outer frame selected and the grid section open, you can select the active grid. Use the Command+C keyboard shortcut, then select the inner frame or any other frame, and press Command+V to paste the style. The style in the second frame can then be further customized as needed. The grid you see now is an example of a 12-column grid. This grid is a common industry standard. You've almost certainly heard of it before. 12 is a great number. It's 12 evenly spaced columns that can be neatly divided, for example, into 2, 3, 4, or 6. So if you want to create a 2-column layout, they will take up 6 of these 12. If you want to make a 3 or 4-column layout, you can also make the appropriate division. Typically, when designing for smaller screen sizes, you will reduce the number of columns in the grid. You can go from 12 to 8, from 8 to 6, from 6 to 4, 2, or maybe even to a 1-column layout. This is called a manuscript grid and can be used, for example, for long grid layouts and mobile versions of websites. There is also such a thing as an adaptive grid system. It is a bit more complex, but just know that it exists. Column and row grids are perfect for designing adaptive interfaces for websites and mobile devices. You can use grids individually or combine them for more complex layouts. Figma also allows you to create independent guides. For this, you will need rulers. If they are not displayed by default, you can use the Shift+R shortcut. This will display rulers on the left and top edges of the canvas. Clicking on the left ruler, for example, and dragging the cursor to the active frame, you can see a red mark at the top showing the current distance of the guide from the left edge of the frame. I will place this guide at a distance of 100 pixels. In the same way, I can create a symmetrical guide from the right edge of the layout. And by clicking and dragging from the top ruler, you can also set equal margins from the top and bottom. These are the basic tools for creating grids in layouts within Figma. The next step is to learn how to use the created grid for layout. I will be working with an informational array of a sports interview, which includes the title, headings, subheadings, questions, answers, and photos. I have already structured the text according to the hierarchy by changing the line height sizes and other settings of elements according to the principles that we discussed in the previous module, Layout Basics. However, this is a very important stage, and it should not be skipped when performing a practical task for this module or layout in general. Let's now look at building a grid for this article. First of all, we need to create a frame that will contain the grid and layout. I press the corresponding F key and create a new frame in the standard desktop size with a width of 1440 pixels. The height of the layout is probably too small right now, but we will increase it if necessary. Now you can apply a grid to the frame by clicking the plus button in the design panel. By default, a square grid will be applied to the frame. I want to use a 3-column grid. I'll change the grid type to column and set 3 columns. I will also choose a blue color for the grid. I will leave the stretch value and set the margins to 100 pixels and the gutters to 40 pixels. That's it. We have created a grid for the screen. Now we can use it to lay out the publication. Let's start placing elements in the layout. Let's start with placing the master heading. For this, I'll place the corresponding text frame near the left edge of the first column. As it moves closer to the edge of the column, an automatic red guide will be displayed, indicating that the active element is aligned with this column. Let's also check the distance from the top edge of the frame with the Alt key and hover over the frame borders. I'll set the margin to 64 pixels. Now let's add a divider. For this, we'll create a line, paint it in the color of the master heading, and set the thickness to 2 pixels. I'll set the size of the divider so that it is 8 pixels away from the master heading. The divider should also be aligned to the grid. This way we have created a header. A header is an element that is repeated on each page of a document and contains information that is important for the reader. Now let's set the title. I'll place it at a distance of 32 pixels from the master heading and align it to the width of 3 columns. Now let's add the subheading. Let's place it at a distance of 40 pixels from the title, aligned to 2 columns. Let's move to the groups of additional details. For example, you can move the groups and align them to the left edge of the last column. However, if you temporarily hide the grid with the Shift+G keys, which is very useful to do during work to check the overall look of your layout, you can see that this alignment is perceived as somewhat inorganic. Therefore, for these elements, I will use the right alignment. In general, this alignment is not used in the web environment as much, but an exception can be made here if the amount of text is small. Since these elements already have the correct line height proportions, you can go to the properties in the design panel and set the spacing between them to 0. Now in the design panel, I will set the alignment of these elements to the right and align the groups to the right edge of the last column of the grid. Additionally, I would like to separate the group with author names from the group with the publication date and time, so I'll increase the spacing between them to 24 pixels. Now let's add the introductory text. Let's place it aligned to 3 columns. After that, we need to move on to the questions and answers. However, you might notice there is currently not enough space for new rows of content. I will select the entire frame and set a larger height value for it. Let's move the frame with the first question to the workspace and place it at a distance of 48 pixels from the subheading. I will also move the frame with the first answer. Between these elements, I will set a minimum spacing of 8 pixels. I want to align this group of text to 1 column, so I will select 2 text frames and drag the right border until it intersects with the right border of the first column. Since I now have a different number of lines, I will update the spacing value in the properties to 8. I will repeat the same actions for the group with the next question and answer. In the third column, I could place 1 more question, but then there could be a feeling that something is missing from the layout, like visual variety. To avoid this, let's add a few images. I want to place the first image under the subheading. For that, I will first move the rest of the elements down. Now I will select the first image and place it at a distance of 56 pixels from the subheading. I will align this image to the same grid by stretching it to 3 columns. The image will automatically adjust to the new size because the fill parameter is selected in the fill behavior settings. The distance from the photo to the next text content will be the same as the top margin above the image, 56 pixels. When using information from third-party sources or images, It is important to give credit to the author. This also helps the reader understand where you got the information from. Let's add a caption with the source of this photo in 14 pixels with 150% line height and set a minimum margin to the photo, 8 pixels. Notice how the caption is set to a gray color. Let's check the margin from the introductory text to the questions. It has to be smaller than the spacing between the photo and the introductory text, 48 pixels. I will place the second image in the third column, next to the first two questions. Then I will place the second caption so that it is aligned to the bottom edge of the text on the left. At the same time, I will set the image height so that the height of the photo and caption module is similar to the previous two, and there is a minimum gap of 8 pixels between them. Now I will add 2 more questions under the first ones. They can be placed in the first and second columns, aligned to the width accordingly. Right now we have some space on the right. Let's say we don't have any more graphic material. What else can we use? We can add a quote to the article. Key phrases pulled from the text can be used as graphic elements to draw attention or add visual interest. These are often called pull quotes. Pull quotes typically use a larger font size than the body text and are positioned strategically to grab the reader's eye. Here are a few instances of pull quotes used effectively. Let's choose a cool phrase from the interview. For example, this one. To do this, you need to select a text fragment, copy it with Command+C, deselect the frame, and create a new one with Command+V. Let's move the new one to the empty space in the last column. Now I want to visually highlight the quote. You already know how to do this. Let's increase the text size to 32, reduce the line height for a more compact look, and choose a bolder font weight. There is only one paragraph here, so the paragraph spacing can be removed. Now it's worth indicating the author of the quote. Let's move the text frames with the player's info and his photo. The author's name should be highlighted, so I will increase its size to 20 pixels and choose a bolder font weight. For the author's title, I will keep the regular font, but I will reduce the text size to 14 pixels. Between the text frames, I can have a 0 spacing thanks to the correct line height, and I will place the entire group at a distance of 16 pixels from the photo. I will also round the corners of the frame that contains the photo and place the whole group at a distance of 24 pixels from the quote. If you take a look at the layout now, you can see that despite the correct alignment, the elements in the last row in the second and third columns should be further divided. To do this, I will add a divider between the quote and the 2 questions by creating a new green line 5 pixels thick and placing it vertically aligned to the height of the previous modules and the left edge of the last column. The distance from the divider to the text should now be updated, for instance, to 48 pixels. To maintain grid harmony, I will reduce the width of the quote frame. After that, I will center the quote horizontally relative to the divider. This additional graphic element helps visually separate 2 text elements of different hierarchy levels. Now let's create a footer. To do this, I'll place another master header on the grid. I will align it to the left edge of the first column and place it at a distance of 64 pixels from the current lowest elements of the layout. To maintain the integrity of the header and footer perception within the layout, let's duplicate a divider with the Alt key and align it relative to the master header and the right edge of the last column. And finally, let's set the height of the frame so that there is a margin of 64 pixels from the bottom. To do this, simply select the frame and drag its bottom border until the same distance is displayed as the top distance. You can hide the grid again to take a look at the final layout. I will rename the frame with the Command+R keys. Let's call it Article. Thus, we have created a layout using a grid and added a quote to it. If you want to use the created grid for a similar or any other layout in the future, you can save this grid as a style. To do this, select the frame to which the desired grid is applied. Go to the Grid section of the Design panel and click the button with 4 circles to go to the Styles panel. Click the plus icon. Give the grid style a name and description, and click the Create Style button. After that, the grid style will be displayed in the local styles of the document in the same way as it would be for text styles or color styles, and it can be applied to other parts of the project. By the way, the grid is a powerful tool, but it's not set in stone. Sometimes, strategically breaking the grid can be effective, like when you want to draw extra attention to something. The key to breaking the grid effectively is maintaining overall balance. even if you strategically deviate with elements like hero images. Large, attention-grabbing visuals often used on start screens. The majority of your design should still follow the grid. This ensures that even when you break the rules, it looks intentional and complements the overall layout. Let's consider a few more factors when laying out plain text. These factors include readability, accessibility, adaptability. Readability means that the text is easy to read and understand. Several factors affect the readability of text, including font size, line height, font and background contrast. In our sports interview layout, the title, subheading, and introduction have a larger font than the main text. This helps the reader quickly understand what the article is about. The main text has a line height of 150%, which means that there is enough space between the lines of text for easy reading. The font color of the main text could be pure black, hex code 0, but you should be careful using it, as it is quite contrasting. It is often better to choose dark shades of gray to make it a little easier on the reader's eyes. The background of the layout is currently white. Pure white, hex code F, can also be a bit too bright for the eyes. Let's replace it with a more neutral shade. Accessibility is also important for everyone, including visually impaired people. This ensures they can access and interact with the content as effectively as anyone else. To do this, in real projects, it is worth using elements such as alternative text for images, as well as the ability to change the font size and line height. Also, keep in mind that people read text on a variety of devices, such as computers, smartphones, and tablets. Therefore, the text must be displayed well on all of these devices. This requires the use of adaptive layout, which allows you to change the size and placement of page elements depending on the screen size of the device. In addition to adaptive layout, there are other elements worth exploring and using when working with text. For example, tables, complex lists, buttons, article or website headers. Creating these elements requires working with auto layout and constraints. We'll take a closer look at these tools in the next Figma courses. Wishing you all the best.